let's kind of dive a little bit deeper into the first question. So let's start it with 2020. So in 2020, thousands of people marched and protested in the city of Portland demanding racial justice. Some protesters called for police reform. Some called for defunding to drastically shrink the size of the police budget, while others called for complete abolition. 4 years later, some elected officials still think of police response when they hear the phrase public safety. At Imagine Black, we think this definition is too narrow. So my question is, and I'm going to start with you first, Novick, what is your definition of community safety? What are your plans to reimagine public safety? Your time starts now.
So, I mean, safety encompasses a large array of topics. Having a safe place to sleep, being safe as much as possible from disease, being safe from preventable medical issues. I mean, such as maternity mortality. It also does include being safe from violent crime or for property crime. And I think, let's see, I mentioned, and it refers to safety on the streets, traffic safety, which is a huge issue in this city. We've seen this horrific rise in traffic deaths. The city has a role to play in providing some services. Among the ones you listed are parks. The city can invest in housing, but it has limited resources to do so. The county has a lot more money to address homelessness issues, for example. And the city is not really set up to provide health care, although the city can helpfully connect people to healthcare services. In terms of reimagining public safety, I referred earlier to the fact that we spend a huge amount of money in this state and this country on prisons, far more than we used to. And that is partly because prison is a free resource to prosecutors. When some prosecutor sends somebody to prison, the state has to pay for it. They don't have to worry about the cost of it. I can't think of any other public service where the person deciding how to spend the money doesn't have to budget for it. And we all know that prison does, there's some people that need to be locked away forever, but generally longer time in prison does not deter crime. In fact, it makes people more likely to reoffend. So I would think the city should lobby the state to give each county a public safety budget for everything, including prisons, which means that if you don't spend money on prisons, you have more money to spend on housing, reentry programs, drug treatment, the things that make a big difference in terms of public safety.
Thank you. Same question to you. What is your definition of community safety, and what are your plans to reimagine public safety? Your time starts now.
Thank you. I think that community safety has been very narrowly defined to only be inclusive of a policing definition, which is traditionally if there's a low level or even violent crime that happens, you send police in to address the issue. And my view of public safety is much more broad. I think as an anti-hunger policy advocate and a legislative strategist, I often think about how money impacts everything. And the reality is that I see that crime, public safety, a lot of what Steve said with regards to public health, housing, community, that all provides public safety as well. And I think that only addressing income inequality is going to be the root of a lot of what was said prior, so I won't repeat that. But I think for me, as far as what I'm looking to do as a city council member would be to expand alternative resources like Portland Street Response. We need a mental health crisis response team that is not criminalizing people for being mentally unwell, for needing resources, or for even having addiction. These are not crimes. These are health issues that need to be responded to with a non-armed, non-police response. I also think that we are seeing other programs at the city really be very fruitful in work when they are addressing the needs of community directly. One of the questions that we'll get into later is the Office of Violence Prevention and the work that they're doing there. But by funding youth programs, making sure that kids have access to education, making sure that kids have access to food is going to ensure that they're not going to be joining a gang or getting into that they actually have a life path that is sustainable and joyful, and that their community is there to support them. So I'm really invested in making sure that we are addressing the income inequalities that have also been created by our prior form of government, because we had no representation in certain parts of the city. So I'm really excited as well to work with candidates or colleagues in District 1 to make sure that Outer East Portland has all of everything that it deserves to have.
Thank you so much. I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of what you all both just mentioned. Starting back with you, Steve, you spoke about lobbying at the state level and the responsibility for our counselors to reach across, I guess, jurisdictions and talk a little bit. You also mentioned some services, some vital services that help prevent crime that may not be within the scope of the city. Can you talk a little bit more about what your plan is to work with maybe the county or even some of our healthcare systems to actually think about what it looks like to prevent crime?
So there's a criminal defense lawyer I've known for almost 30 years in town, and I asked her a few months ago something I should have asked her a long time ago, which is, if we were going to prevent crime, what would we do? And she said, invest more in drug treatment. That the people getting off drugs is key to, and I think she probably included alcohol in that, as key to preventing crime. The city is a small part of the public safety system, but obviously the city is partly responsible for public safety. The county has the jail, and the county is supposedly the mental health provider. We do not have enough mental health services. We do not have enough treatment services. And one way the legislature is supposedly focused on the problem. They've allocated some money to it. But I think one significant source of money is the money that we are spending on prisons. Because we spend a hell of a lot of money on prisons, and it's an overused resource because, again, it's free. Prosecutors can send people to prison without thinking about the cost. So what I would want to do is go with the county to the state and say, you need to tell prosecutors that prisons have a cost. And you need to tell the counties, we're going to give you an overall budget for public safety. And you can spend it on whatever you want that's related to public safety. But if you don't spend a huge chunk of it on prisons, you could spend more on drug treatment, on reentry programs, people being released from prison, on housing for people, on mental health services, a bunch of things that we relate to public safety, and which, unlike sending somebody to prison for 7 years instead of 2 years, which winds up actually making them more likely to reoffend, actually make a difference in terms of preventing crime.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back with you because I would love to hear a little bit more about how you would work with the county as well. But I'm going to pass it to you, responding to what you mentioned a little bit earlier. I know you've been really outspoken and have been really, especially on social media, have been talking about this issue for a pretty long time. I also know that you've been having some conversations around whether it's decrim or talking about drug treatment. Can you share a little bit more about your position and how you think you'll work across not just the aisle, but also with the county and other spaces to really make sure that we are thinking about community safety holistically?
Are you talking about House Bill 4002?
I am. I
All right,
am.
I'll get into it. I lobbied on House Bill 4002, so this is perfect. So I work at Partners for Hunger Free Oregon, and we, as an organization, an anti-poverty statewide organization, decided to take the stance to fight against recriminalization of drugs in Oregon, because we, as anti-hunger advocates, know how much that is going to affect low-income people, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities in Oregon. And we decided that it was time to bring that lens into that work, because state legislators were not necessarily talking about it from that approach. I have firmly stood against recriminalization of drugs. I think the fact that we are punishing people for addiction when it is a health issue that needs to be treated through health services is a huge problem. And right now, we don't have the treatment centers for people who are willingly and begging, trying to get into those treatment centers to make sure that they're getting the care that they need. So the Hoover Center in Oregon is actually turning away around 200 people a month who are trying to get into treatment. So we're having this whole discussion about whether or not people should be punished for the crime of having an addiction, and we're not even offering the services to send them to treatment or to deferment instead of sending them to jail, which means that inevitably we are going to have young Black, Brown, and Indigenous people going into our local jails and prisons and perpetuating the prison industrial complex. So I think it was very short-sighted for the legislature to overturn this policy so quickly. There's also a lot of issues with House Bill 4002 and the fact that there is not enough funding for staffing, so that when these treatment centers are created, which will be a decade down the line anyways, we are not going to have sufficient staffing to ensure that the programs are successful once they get off the ground. So I think that we were sold a false promise that we're just going to recriminalize drugs and then all of our problems will be solved and we can put these problem people away somewhere where we don't have to see them, because that's really what the discussion is here. It's not about treating the heart or the root of the issue. It's about just hiding people so that we don't have to deal with them as a society. And we're not going to have the results that we want from that.
Thank you so much. It seems like I'm hearing some synergy around more treatment centers and putting money in the right place. I'm going to go back to you a little bit. Thank you for sharing that policy idea, and particularly like breaking it down of how it would possibly look. You were formerly a part of our city as a former commissioner. Can you talk a little bit more about what you see as an opportunity to work with those different, we're working with the county in particular, and what that could look like?
I mean, the city and the county, as you know, have had a rather lousy relationship. I've known my county commissioner, Julia Edwards, for a very long time, and we have a good relationship. I think that the city and the county, I think that a lot of the voters in Portland and Multnomah County have the sense that they voted for lots of taxes to solve lots of problems, and the problems aren't being solved, so what the hell is happening with the money? So I think one thing that the city and the county need to do together is, first of all, stop blaming each other for stuff. But second, I think city and county officials need to be sort of engaging the public on what do we spend money on? What results are we looking for? What's the right balance of what we spend money on in terms of things like public safety? What can the city do with its resources? What can the county do with its resources? What can't they do because they don't have the resources? And so I think that that just having that conversation and being honest about that is itself useful. And I think that, again, in terms of public safety, we can, collectively point out that, as Angelita was just saying, there aren't the resources for drug treatment, for example. But there also is all this money being spent on prisons, which the state gives us for free. And I think that, this is something I've been talking about for 10 years. And actually, if Mike Schmidt had stayed as DA, I think it's something he would have lobbied on. But I think that to say, look, we know as a city and a county that investing in prisons is not the best use of public safety dollars, but it's something the state gives us for free. Why don't you give us the option to spend it on something that actually works?
Thank you so much. I'll insert some fun commentary here. I know at Imagine Black, we talk a lot about prisons and the cost, like you mentioned, but also just inhumane it is, how difficult it is to get the services that you need, and it's not the best way to get the health care or the treatment services.
And could I add something?
Go for it, yeah.
So I
give you a
think
minute.
there's a criminal justice researcher in Florida named John Pfaff who wrote this book, I can't remember the name of it, where he says that liberals in America have made it sound like the prisons are used mostly to lock people up for nonviolent drug offenses, which isn't really true. And what he said is, yeah, most of the people in prison at any given time are there for some violent crime, but that doesn't mean that they should be there for as long as they are for that violent crime. That if somebody isn't just totally beyond the pale, at some point they're going to come out, and it does not make people less likely to reoffend if they're in for 7 years rather than 2. So, you hardly see any politicians in this country, except maybe Cory Booker, saying we need to reduce prison sentences for violent crime, but we need to talk about that, because we do. Because if somebody beats somebody up in a bar fight, does no good to lock them up for 6 years instead of 6 months or whatever.
Thank you for that. With 1 minute, I'm going to pass it to you. Do you have any comments? I have some additional questions, but yeah, do you want to talk at all about prisons and anything around that space? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we talk about, I really appreciate that Steve is bringing up that jails and prisons are being used as a shorthand for offering the treatment that we actually need. And I want to point out that our county jails are also not only not giving people those resources, but actively harming them as well. The reality is that in Multnomah County, we had numerous people who were waiting in our local county jails die because they committed suicide, they overdosed, or they were not given the proper access to medical treatment that they are required to receive. And so the fact that we are sending people to our local jails because there are no treatment centers available for them to a place where they could possibly die means that you are sentencing people to death for the crime of being poor or for the crime of having addiction or other diseases, right? And I just think that that is very indicative of the fact that we don't value these people and we would rather them die or be hidden away from society than actually treat each other as human beings that are deserving of love, care, and community, who are able to, everyone is able to be reintegrated back. I do firmly believe that. And the fact that our local jails are set up in such a way that it would cause people to lose their lives is very concerning.
Thank you for bringing that in. Thank you both. I want to circle back to something you were talking about a little bit earlier. Just your background as being, a hunger, advocate and working so much within the food systems. Can you talk a little bit about community safety as a whole? I think right now, again, we usually really narrow it within police or sometimes fire and a little bit into street response, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Do you have any plans or any ideas of what it would look like to really think about food and hunger for the city, and something that I don't think the city has talked about enough? But yeah, I'll give you 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually talking with a lot of advocates who do more like agricultural and placemaking work, and some ideas that have been floating around from different neighborhoods in District 3 were about creating communal like food forests in the local parks that are sustainable, that are created in such a way that you have buy-in from the neighbors, so that everyone is actually communally taking care of this space. And we know that in the city of Portland, it's highly competitive to get into a community garden. Sometimes you're on a list for 10 years. So this is a community need and want that people have that I think would also bring people together if they're having to tend to this food resource together and take care of it. And I think just having access to land that is owned by the community, that they're getting to take care of, that they're getting to cultivate, that is a communal process where you're meeting your neighbors, you're having to negotiate together. All of that is bonding. All of that is community safety, in my opinion, because you're actually getting to know your neighbors, especially in a time where people are so isolated from each other. So I think that's something I'm really interested in. I also just think on a more simple level, we need to make sure that the rent is affordable so that people can actually afford their food at the grocery store. It doesn't have to be as fancy as creating a food forest in your local city, although I think that's very exciting. People just need to have lower rent so that they can actually afford to go to the grocery store and get food. And I've talked about this before, but I'm one of 3 candidates that has experienced homelessness in the city of Portland. And when I was in college, I was homeless for a little under a year, and I did not have regular access to food, and my friends had to steal food from the cafeteria to keep me fed. And there are certain people on the campaign trail that have used that against me and said that that I'm advocating for crime and theft. And I said, no, but we're organic beings that need to eat. And if we don't meet people's basic human needs, then they're going to do whatever they have to do to get access to what they need. So I think that when we provide that safety and support for people, we're just going to see a much happier and more thriving city.
Thank you so much for that. How disappointing for folks to weaponize something like that. And thank you for sharing and being vulnerable with us. We're almost done before we move on to talk a little bit about the Portland Street Response, but something you mentioned.
Would you mind if I said something about food?
Oh, you know what? I would love to. Let's go for it.
The city, providing food to people is generally, doesn't fall within any particular city responsibility. And generally, I'm going to be cautious about saying the city should spend money on like a new thing that it's not doing now. However, the city has the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which has lots of money, lots more than people imagined. And I think, the biggest source of carbon emissions is transportation, and I think the Clean Energy Fund should be investing a lot more in climate-friendly transportation. But about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from food, and it comes from, some foods are really climate friendly, like lentils and chickpeas. Some foods are really climate unfriendly, like beef or pork. And so I actually think that for one thing, I think the city should encourage or perhaps even require food establishments to like post up on the wall the sort of relative climate friendliness of different kinds of food, so people know that, because I don't think they do. But also, I think that there's an argument for the city to subsidize climate-friendly food, at least on an episodic basis, to say, for this 2-week period, anybody should just take lentils from the grocery store, because that's probably the most, in terms of the amount of nutrition for the least amount of greenhouse gases, that's probably lentils and chickpeas are probably it. And say, we will subsidize that, and we also hand out good recipes so that people can find out delicious ways to make lentils and chickpeas. Because if people are able to make that transition to using, to more plant-based diet, that does in fact impact global warming, and obviously it's lower income people will benefit from having any kind of free food. That's one of my more out there ideas, but I really think it's something that needs to be explored, because politicians tend to shy away from the food part of climate change because they're afraid they're going to be accused of banning hamburgers. But we can at least be encouraging and helping people to eat more climate friendly food.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate both of your imagination in the space and backing it up with ideas and even policy proposals that could happen. We're about to move on, but there was something that was mentioned by you a little bit earlier that I'd love to get your thoughts on. You talked about community members participating in the budget, and I was like, participatory budgeting is what I heard a little bit about. I want to just hold some space for it. I know there's a campaign that's currently paused, but hopefully we'll come back, and wanted to get your thoughts on participatory budgeting and what that could potentially look like now that our government is changing quite a bit in Portland, and having a little bit more opportunities for our elected officials to do policy work and to really dive into the budget. Budgeting is going to be really, really important coming up. And yeah, would love to hear you talk about participatory budgeting if you can.
Well, I'm delighted by the idea of participatory budgeting. I think it's such an exciting way to get people involved in local government in a way that they're normally very cynical about, because we don't really make it accessible or easy for people to understand. I know I worked at City Hall for 3 years. I was doing constituent services, but you learn a lot about the budget doing that. And it's really hard to track and follow. No one knows what the fall bump is, the fall budget monitoring process and all these things, right? And then on top of that, if people don't feel like, in the summer of 2020, we had 75,000 Portlanders write us emails saying that they wanted to either reduce and reallocate the police budget or turn the entire police budget back into community hands for alternative resources, right? And if City Council fails to address what people are coming in mass droves to say, then they don't feel a buy-in for that process. But with participatory budgeting, I think they have access to 5% of the budget, if I'm not mistaken, that community can come together to make proposals around and to decide what they want to do with their city dollars. And I think that also, I firmly believe that power is kind of a corrupting force, and that we need to always give power back to community in the decision-making process whenever possible, so that we are not corrupted by it. Especially with a district system, we have an opportunity to get people's buy-in and input for what they want to see in their communities in a way that we've never seen before. So I love the idea of participatory budgeting. I think the city with the district system could do great outreach on that, and to get people more involved and excited because they actually have a hand in crafting what it is the city is going to do.
Thank you so much. We're going to put some links in our captions with some more information about what we heard. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about budgeting, so we'll get back to you around participatory budgeting. But I just want to share for folks listening and watching that just thinking about the demands of 2020, there's a lot of misinformation that we have defunded our police and that we've even shrunk their budget. And in fact, that is not true. Our current budget for the Portland Police is nearly $3 million. If you look back into 2016, Street Roots did a great article recently that we'll also put in the chat around just how large it has grown. And in 2016 to now, I believe it's a 42% increase, around 88 million increase. So we have not defunded. In fact, we've actually increased it quite a bit.